Good morning, guys. So, in this video, I thought I'm basically going to touch on something that hit me just yesterday. So I was making just another video, and I was talking basically about how horribly, like, how bad it feels to break something in production for a developer, and how kind of how to handle that a little bit, and like my experiences doing so. And I realized that I was throwing around all these terms: development, staging, production, and I realized that maybe that's not so clear to everybody what that actually means. So I thought in this video I'm going to talk about that and just explain to someone who isn't working as a professional developer usually how a software company, or rather how code comes from your computer into the application that you're using. Now, this is just a general way it works, but in general, this almost every single company I've ever worked for and ever talked to have a structure very similar to this. So usually what happens is that we developers, we have some type of programming environment, and basically what that is, it depends on the programming language you're using. You can have something called an IDE, integrated developer environment, which is a specialized tool. Think of it as a text editor, but for code. And some of us, let's say that you're using something like Java. Let's say you do that. Then it's very common you use something like Eclipse or IntelliJ, and basically these are just tools that help you write software. That's it. And that is called your local environment. Basically, that's us being fancy and trying to express that, hey, it works in my environment, which basically just means that, hey, I ran the code on my computer, everything is working. And that's usually where things go wrong. If it works on your computer but it doesn't work for anybody else, then usually something's wrong. Anyway, so that's what we call a local environment, or a workstation, or something that, something like that basically. There's a few flavors of that term, but that's in essence what it means. And so you may or may not know this, but databases and all the different programs that you use that make up a web page or a web application and so forth are usually run locally because it would be very difficult for us to make some code and then save it and push it into production and test if it works. So we need a local instance of the program to run on our own computer, so we can just make sure that everything works before we send it out to the users. So that's a local environment. And then you usually have something like a test pipeline or something like that, and usually you have something called a version control system that saves your code. And the most common way of saving code in today's world is Git, which is Git is an entire talk in of itself, but Git is used to save code. In essence, that's what it's used for. It's called version control. You should look that up if you're getting into programming. If you've learned programming and you want to get into GitHub and Bitbucket and all these other flavors, GitLab as well, this is that would be the next step for you to learn, because Git is a very fundamental part of being a modern software developer. You can also use Mercurial. Some people do that as well. I think Facebook is actually using Mercurial, but Git is by far the most common and famous one, if you will. So what you do after you've done your changes in your code is that you save that code to a central repository. Basically, that's just a term for, okay, that's where your code is saved. GitHub is a great example. It's one of the world's biggest code repositories. I have my code there as well. You can go to GitHub and check out my old projects that I've been working on, and that's that's the code that I wrote to make that project into what it is. And for usually for bigger companies, or any company, we, at least at my company, we use GitLab. So we have something called a release pipeline, or a CI pipeline, continuous integration or continuous delivery, call it what you want, pipeline. And so what that is basically is that I save my code and then I push it to another computer, basically a remote environment, somewhere that is not my computer, out on the interwebs, and it runs a few different jobs that we have set up ahead of time to make sure that my code works. Usually this is, it runs a bunch of tests and like make sure that everything is running perfect, running well and so forth. And if it all passes, then I have the option of releasing my code into usually a testing environment. Now, what is a testing environment? Or basically a testing environment is a computer set up in the same way as the computer that is going to run the code for the users. And the reason why this is important is because there's always a difference between the stuff that you have on your computer and the stuff that's on the web. So you want to be able to have something that is very, very, very similar to almost identical. Ideally, you should have it identical to the setup that the users themselves are going to use when they are using your application. So that's very important to have a testing environment. It's usually called something like staging or test or something like that. And that is the place where, your testers or the people who are going to verify, like your colleagues and so forth, are just going to check out your feature, make sure that it works perfectly and like all that good stuff. And when you finally have done all that, and everybody says, yeah, testing environment is working, everything seems to be fine, Fredrik, your feature is ready to be shipped. Then you push it to production. And production is where it's our jargon for live. This is what the users are now using. If it's when the feature is available to the general population or like your users in general. So those are the different environments for pushing code, basically. So this is a very brief introduction to how code comes from your computer all the way into your user's experience, basically. There are different things that may or may not happen along the way, but that's the general way code makes it from your computer to the users. Hopefully this was useful to you.